Megan, thank you for having me. Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you all. For those who have had videos and who have come in the past to CEP Community Live, welcome. And to those who are new, also welcome too. My name is Gregory LaFortune. I'm a dietitian here who works at the Cognitive Empowerment Program. Really excited to be with you all today. And today's discussion is going to be about whole grains. And as Megan was asking me, why is it important? Is because I think that we have all developed some sort, and I can't say all, but many of us in this country have developed some sort of fear around carbohydrates or some type of distrust. You hear a lot more that carbs are not good for me or carbs are bad for me. While the Mind Diet is recommending that we do consume a specific kind of carbohydrate, aka as known as a whole grain, right? So we want our carbohydrates to be more whole grains, more fruits, more of those starchy vegetables, and less of those added sugars, desserts, cookies, and sweets. So that's why it's going to be important for us to discuss this today. And even in the realm of physical activity and increasing our physical activity, it's very important to have healthy whole grains on our side to help support our overall health journeys, as it pairs very well with physical activity. So this is why we're going to be discussing these things today. Also, too, next month is National Whole Grains Month. This is something that I looked up and found that September is National Whole Grains Month. So what a better time, or it is a great time. There's no other better time for us to discuss this than today's session to talk about whole grains and their importance in your overall diet. So again, happy to be here. So when it comes to the Mind Diet, I always like to just reemphasize some of the top brain foods that are on the Mind Diet. If you're not familiar with the Mind Diet, I recommend you check it out. This is what we really prioritize in the nutrition sessions that we have here at CEP. And we really talk about each one in depth and why it's important. So for today's session, I'll be going more in depth about the whole grain section, but maybe in future sessions, you'll hear more about some of the other foods and why you should include those in the Mind Diet. So let's get this out the way. Why does my body need carbs? Well, let's just understand that carbohydrates are going to be your body's primary source of energy. This means that a lot of times when you may have a headache, or maybe times where you fasted for a long period of time, maybe you have dizziness, brain fog, irritability. I know some people get really irritable when they are hungry, right? This is possibly most likely due to a lack or depletion of carbohydrates in your body, particularly a lack or depletion of carbohydrates in your brain. That's very important to know. You need carbohydrates because carbs are the body's main source of energy. When carbs are not present, the body converts other nutrients into energy, such as proteins and fats. So let's say, for example, somebody who is on an extremely low carbohydrate diet, or who decides to entirely avoid carbohydrates in their diet, the body's going to require some form of energy to be created. Now, since you're not getting that from the carbohydrates, the body will then revert to proteins and fats to convert those into energy. Well, if my body's converting protein into energy when protein is supposed to be helping me maintain my muscle mass, this can then lead to losses in muscle mass, right? This can also lead to losses in a lot of other things as well. So it's important for us to consume a healthy amount of carbohydrates and the right carbohydrates so that our bodies are optimizing its energy stores. Carbs are extremely nutritious. Carbs pair well with many foods, and they help to add to a healthy and balanced diet. So these are some basic reasons why I want to encourage you to have an outlook on carbohydrates that's positive and to include the right kind of carbohydrates into your diet. Now, fiber. Fiber is a type of carbohydrate that's found in many foods, specifically in whole grains, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, in this slide here, you have different terms like fermentable versus non-fermentable, right? This is saying that our gut can either break it down, ferment it, or not break it down, non-fermentable. And these two different types of fibers have different roles in our bodies. It can help with our overall stool, and you'll see that in a second, why it's important. Now, out of all of these, insoluble fiber is what I want you to remember. This is what most whole grains are going to contain: insoluble fiber. This means that they do not dissolve in water and pass through our digestive tract, which can help with our stool, which can help with our overall digestion. And on its way out of our body, it can also carry a lot of waste and other things along with it, which can promote a healthy digestive tract, healthy bowel movements, and healthy overall functioning of our overall bodies and our entire bodies. So fiber is going to be found in a lot of carbohydrate type of foods that we'll discuss today. Now, the recommendations for fiber: 25 grams a day for women and 38 grams a day for men. This is a great place to be, and majority of Americans are not even getting remotely close to these recommendations. So it may seem like it's a lot, but we should absolutely try to increase our fiber each day in our overall diets. And we can do that when we are consuming more healthy carbohydrates, aka more healthy whole grains. So again, just a couple of other things that fiber can do: aids with stool mass and stool softening. So with insoluble fiber, the ones that is found in whole grains, this can help give our stool some mass, increase the bulk of our stool, especially if we have diarrhea, for example. So that can add mass and bulkness to our stool to help with that elimination process. For people who have prediabetes or diabetes, or who are at risk of prediabetes or diabetes, dietary fiber can help control our blood sugar. The type of fiber that's found in whole grains has a positive correlation with better blood sugars. That's why when somebody who has diabetes consumes higher fiber, their blood sugars are more likely to be regulated, controlled in comparison to someone that does not consume fiber. And it's better to get that fiber from plant sources of foods like whole grains. Fiber helps to lower our cholesterol, helps to feed our gut bacteria. This is what we call a prebiotic. And it also travels via the gut-brain axis to help decrease the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. So all in all, dietary fiber is going to be found in these healthy carbohydrates, in these healthy whole grains that we're going to talk about today. Not only those, but also fruits and vegetables in general. But since we're talking about whole grains, we're going to just mainly talk about those. Now, minerals. Now, if we're talking about minerals such as magnesium, iron, zinc, copper, these are all found in whole grains as well. They support different areas of our bodies, like our gut health, our skin health, our brain health, muscle health, and more. Magnesium, for example, is really important for helping our muscles contract. It's also very healthy for our blood pressures. So magnesium that is found in whole grains can help with our overall blood pressure, can help with our muscle contraction, and to support our heart health and our brain health too. Iron is also really important for blood flow, for your red blood cell formation. So the whole grains that contain iron in them can help with your overall blood flow and overall iron stores inside of your body. You have other minerals like zinc, copper. There are a ton. But what I just want you to take from here is that whole grains will contain a higher percentage of minerals than your ultra processed or refined grains. I want to get into that and what that even means. So we want to consume these whole grains because of the potent minerals that they contain to support our health. So here are some examples of some whole grains. You have things like oatmeal, and this is not all of them, but this is just a few. Oatmeal, quinoa, whole wheat, brown rice, wild rice, bulgur, farro, millet, buckwheat, barley. Again, these are just a couple of examples of whole grains that we want to include in our diets to support our health. The Mind Diet recommends it. And just looking at this list, are there any whole grains that you enjoy the most, or maybe there's one on here that you really like that you don't see on this list, go ahead and share in the chat. I want to see what type of whole grains that we're eating in the chat. I know for my household, we do a pretty good amount of quinoa and oatmeal. Oatmeal in different forms, whether that's oatmeal in a smoothie. I know a couple of weeks ago at CEP, we made smoothies that had oatmeal in them. And as a matter of fact, we opened up the pantry, we opened up the refrigerator and just saw what we had laying there. Oatmeal was in there. So we decided to use the oatmeal and throw that into our smoothie. So it was really tasty. But what types of grains are you consuming? I see someone said rice, brown rice, oatmeal, rye flour. See some good options there. Someone said we have quinoa pretty much daily. Also, we use sprouted oats. So sprouted grains, that's another category of a whole grain, right? Not too different than a whole grain, other than the fact that sprouted grains can contain more nutrients than your unsprouted whole grains. So they're both great, but if you're trying to get a more digestible type of carbohydrate, going the sprouted grain route can be a good option for you. Someone said whole wheat, brown rice, oatmeal. My parents are from Haiti and we do a lot of bulgur, right? So that's one of those whole grains that are extremely fibrous, high fiber type of whole grain. Again, most of them all will contain fiber to some extent. And in general, there's no one grain, no one whole grain that's better than the other whole grain. They're all great and you should be including them into your diets. Another thing I want to mention too, when we're considering how many or how much whole grains we should be having, our dietary guidelines for Americans recommends that we make at least half of our grains whole grains. Okay, at least half of our grains, we should be striving for those to be whole grains. Now, why include whole grains? The reason why we want to consume whole grains. Yeah, someone said, okay, thank you for that, Megan. So the reason why we want to strive to have whole grains, well, first off, let's understand what the Mind Diet is recommending for us. When it comes down to it, we want to have 3 servings of a whole grain per day. Now, 1 serving is equivalent to 1 cup of cooked whole grains. And excuse me, this is an error. This should say 1/2 cup cooked whole grain. So in order for us to, no, I'm sorry, that's actually correct. 1 cup cooked whole grain, I'm sorry. That's what 1 serving of whole grain looks like. Now, maybe we're consuming this, maybe we're not getting this, but if we're really trying to understand what this looks like, 3 servings of a whole grain per day, which means that at least 1 serving of a whole grain per meal, right? We don't have to look at it as 3 servings all at once, but we can split that up in the whole day, 1 serving per meal. Somebody said 1/2 of a cup is not so much. The reason why I indicated 1/2 of a cup is because if you convert 1/2 a cup of uncooked whole grain, which is like rice, oats, or something like that, it cooks to about 1 full cup. So that's why the serving size is 1 cup cooked of that whole grain. Is 1 slice of bread considered a serving? Roughly, yes. You do have some pieces of bread that may be a little bit more than a serving because they are larger. For example, there are like those large multi-grain breads, for example, that might be maybe 1.5 times the size of your normal slice of bread. That would be considered more than 1 serving, but still falling within the parameters of that 3 servings per day. And even if you're getting more than 3 servings per day, that's fine as well. But the Mind Diet wants you to at least consider 3 servings per day of your whole grain. Vitamin E. So vitamin E is a antioxidant that is also found in nuts and seeds, but also found in whole grains as well. And there is a lot of research on the positive correlation between vitamin E and its ability to protect your brain from oxidation and inflammation. So vitamin E is a really powerful antioxidant found in whole grains that you can get from consuming whole grain products. And of course, we talked about insoluble fiber to support our gut and our brain health. B vitamins. B vitamins are something, you might have heard of things like niacin or riboflavin, thiamine. These are called B vitamins, right? And you might have heard of B12. You might have heard of folate, right? That's B9. So whole grains give you some B vitamins. And some grains are fortified even with B vitamins if they don't contain them naturally. So eating whole grains is a great way for us to increase our overall B vitamin consumption. And B vitamins are very important for really helping your body to create energy, right? So the whole grains that you're consuming is also giving you this B vitamin to help produce more energy, to give your body the capability to make more energy, which is really good for us. Only thing I would say is that people with diabetes may have to monitor their whole grain intake. That's one of the biggest disclaimers I'll put out there. Someone that has no risk of diabetes or pre-diabetes, who's generally very active, whose A1C is normal, may be able to tolerate grains or carbohydrates better than the person who has diabetes, pre-diabetes, or any type of insulin resistance. This is very important to know and to discuss with your dietitian or your doctor to find out how many whole grains or how many grams of carbohydrates you should be aiming for in the day. And if you don't have a stove, no problem. There are some microwavable grains that can be equally healthy, but also more convenient for you. The goal here is to increase our whole grain intake, whatever it takes. And even if we're trying to limit our overall carbohydrate intake, we should still be aiming to increase our whole grain intake to try to make that the main type of carbohydrate or grains that we are consuming. So there are many different ways to include whole grains into your diet. Again, the Mind Diet recommends 3 servings. 3 servings equals 1 cup of cooked whole grain. Now, let's say, for example, like sandwiches, right? It's really hard to get a cup of a sandwich or a cup of bread for that sandwich. So in this case, we can consider those 2 slices as your 2 servings of your whole grain, right? Incorporating your whole grains into pasta. Let's say, for example, you get normal enriched flour pasta or, just typical white flour, all-purpose flour. You can convert that and use whole grain flour or use whole wheat pasta or whole grain pasta to increase some of those vitamins like that fiber, those B vitamins that I shared with you earlier. You can use brown rice or wild rice. Very good examples of good fibrous rice to use for your meals. Inside of your soups, this is such a great opportunity to incorporate those whole grains because many times we don't really even taste them or know that they're there. It's almost like including spinach into your smoothie, sneaking it in there, not really feeling or tasting that it's there, but still reaping the nutrient benefits that it contains. So feel free to incorporate those whole grains into your soups, your stews, your pastas, your rice, your sandwiches, and even your salads. Doing like a cooked whole grain into your salad can be a great way to add nutrients, but also give your salad some personality and some bulk because many times we consider salad as the gold standard of health food, but then wonder why we're very hungry after eating a salad. It's most likely because our salad was not bulky enough or didn't contain enough life and vitality in it or just foods or nutrients in general inside of it to help compensate for some of that hunger. So incorporating a whole grain can help you get some of that healthy fibers, some extra protein, as well as a lot of these other vitamins that we're mentioning here. So feel free to incorporate some whole grains into some of these foods here. And I just want to talk about why this whole grain concept is really important. I want to introduce to you the anatomy of a grain, and let's break it down for a second. We have different components of a grain. And if we think of a grain, there are so many different types of grain, as I shared with you earlier. You have wheat, you have barley, you have buckwheat, you have oats. All of these are examples of grains. Now, what makes a whole grain is the fact that all three of these components are inside of that grain, are intact, are still there. And as you see on the bottom right, it says the bran and the germ are removed when whole grains are refined. So in order for us to get from that whole grain to that, or that white bread, I'm sorry, that whole grain bread, or that whole wheat bread to that white bread, the processing in that removed the germ and it removed the bran, meaning that it removed the fiber, the B vitamins, the minerals. Also, it removed the germ, more B vitamins, vitamin E, phytochemicals. A lot of nutrients are removed in the processing of a whole grain. That's how we end up with a lot of products that are on the shelf today. A lot of products like these sweet treats, for example, they're not using whole grains for these candies and pastries and desserts. They're using a highly refined, highly ultra processed type of grain to make them. Because honestly, I think that if we were to leave them, for example, can you imagine what a whole grain Pop Tart would taste like? You know, they probably wouldn't be as popular, right? It's because that fibrous taste, a lot of those B vitamins, they do affect the flavor of that grain. And in order to create more diverse products, a lot of times that processing is done so that they can manipulate the grain to make any type of product or taste profile that they want. So it's really important to know that, right? So whenever you taste something and that's a whole grain and you're saying, I don't like this because it's too healthy. I hear this all the time. It tastes too healthy, Greg. Well, the truth is it tastes too healthy because it has too many great vitamins, too many great minerals, too many great things about it, which is helping your body in the long run. I want you to focus more on these and less of some of those processed grains. And also, too, the processing of grains help to extend the shelf life. You look at certain products, and there are certain products, and I'm just wondering how in the world is this product still, still okay to eat after 2 years, after a year? It's because in that processing, removing that bran, removing that germ in that whole grain is helping to extend the shelf life. And when you remove these portions of the whole grain, what you are left with is mainly the carbohydrates. And that's where we get into trouble, right? Especially with my people who are really trying to monitor and watch their blood sugar. When you remove that fiber out of that grain over a long period of time, it's only going to lead to problems in your blood sugar, especially if you're not taking care of your blood sugar. If you're eating whole grains that are refined and ultra processed, but then you're also eating um, other things on top of those whole grains, or on top of these refined grains that have added sugar and extra carbohydrates and extra calories, then this can possibly become a problem, especially if you're trying to watch out for your blood sugar, trying to watch out for your heart health, trying to watch out and manage your weight. This can be a problem. So that's why it's very important to include that whole grain, which can help with your fullness, which can help with the nutrient content, help with your energy levels, and really help to maintain your health in a lot of fashions. So that's why we need whole grains for our whole brains. And I just want to open up the floor to see if there's any questions about whole grains, why we should include them, or even strategies or ways to incorporate them. I want to see if anyone had any questions about these.
So
I remember. Oh, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, Greg. We definitely have a lot of enthusiasm, I think, for busting some of the myths around eating carbs and carbohydrates. I think a lot of folks kind of remember that craze against carbohydrates. And so it's nice to remember why they're important and kind of bust some of the stigma around them. We do have a question about, what can we do with grains that maybe we're a little bit more unfamiliar with? Like maybe if we've never tried barley or some of the other grains that you mentioned, what are some suggestions that you have for becoming more familiar or trying those out in the home?
I would say at least introductory wise, what we can possibly do. Like, let's say, for example, there's something very familiar that we're accustomed to having. For example, like a like a baked good, right? Instead of using regular flour or white flour, we can try using something like barley flour, right? That's just one way we can incorporate using that product that we are not as accustomed to into a dish that maybe we are accustomed to eating or accustomed to making, right? So also too, eating, let's say, for example, if we eat rice or any type of grain for that matter, just trying out that new grain within that, right? Maybe we do 50% barley, 50% rice. Or maybe we just have the barley, but then make it the same exact way we would make the rice as far as like the seasoning and the flavoring. These are just some ways that we can be more familiar with the product that we're not as familiar with.
And a lot of the products that we're talking about, like barley and some of the other ones, are very similar to cooking rice. It's a little bit harder when we start with it, add a little bit of water or some stock or some broth and kind of cook those down a little bit. One of the things I'll also say about doing it that way is it can be very affordable for a lot of homes to buy dried grains and cook them at home like that brown rice. And
Yeah.
that's a really favorite on the table for most families is brown rice. So being creative is fun, but we can also stick to some of the old favorites like that we know so well. And one of the questions that came up, especially around bread sometimes, is how to know when something is processed and when it is not. Can you say a little bit about processed or over processed grains and ones that are not, and maybe what difference that would make?
Yeah. So with the processing, you can tell a processed grain mostly by the color of the grain, because in general, we know that most grains are going to fall within that brown category, right? Whether that's light brown, darker brown, for example, oats might be a little bit lighter brown in comparison to bulgur, which is dark brown. So typically that color is a good indicator, right? And if we see a grain that is lighter or whiter in color, most likely it's a more processed type of grain. Also, too, grains that are incorporated into products, right? A lot of sweets and pastries, we can tell that these are processed mainly because of that color. And also, too, just because of all the other sugar that's being added on top of it as well. We can deem that as something that might not be as health conscious or health beneficial for us. But on the other hand, a grain that's not processed will typically be sold as a dried grain, or it might be indicated that this is a whole grain bread, a whole wheat product. These are our indications of knowing that it is in fact that whole grain that is intact. Sometimes you might have crackers that are made with whole grain. So these are all things too that can be beneficial as well. But the way that we know that we're getting the least processed grain as much as possible is actually purchasing that grain in its least processed form as often as possible.
Really good thoughts about kind of getting the least processed version of it that's the closest to the way that it started. One of the things that came up in the chat is a really hot topic around sourdough bread, this
Yeah.
kind of fermented bread. How good is it for you? How does it compare in this whole grain conversation? What are your thoughts around sourdough bread and the mind diet?
Yeah, sourdough bread is not necessarily one of those things that is considered on the mind diet. However, I can say that just the fermentation process of that already is going to speak to the overall quality of the fiber that's in that bread. Because typically, those fermented foods have really good fiber in them, like sourdough bread in this case. Also, too, there's some protein in there. There's some other minerals in sourdough bread. So there are some benefits of that sourdough bread that may not fall within that category of your whole grain bread per se. So what does that mean? That means that yes, we can experience some benefits from that. But I still don't want us, even with the whole grains, we still have to be mindful of the amount of some of these whole grains that we consume. It's still saying that we should incorporate them, but we still shouldn't overdo it. And it's the same concept with the sourdough bread. Even though it contains great benefits, great nutrients, for someone who needs to watch or monitor their carb intake, that still can be problematic despite all of the health benefits that a sourdough bread may contain. So feel free to incorporate it, but then still we want to still aim to get our whole grains in as often as possible. with the occasional sourdough bread. That's perfectly fine too.
And I love the ideas that are coming in the chat about pancakes. There's so many people who are saying they're using all these different combinations of rye flour, whole flour, and all different combinations with pancakes. And so, something that we can get creative with is adding a little scoop of whole wheat flour into some of those old recipes, something that was a popular conversation today. But as simple as maybe just adding it into your pancake batter, something that we all have on hand, usually pretty easily. Finding different ways to incorporate things like buckwheat flour and things like that too. Any thoughts about any other quick recipes or house favorites that you might add or substitute with whole grains?
I know people that do it with cookies, like fresh baked cookies. Now, they won't completely replace the completely replace that flour, but that can be one strategy. And Megan, what you just said, when it comes down to it, just adding it in there, right? If we're substituting with a little bit more whole grain flour as that we normally would do, right? Also, too, if we are finding ways to add less sugar to those baked goods that we're possibly consuming with a little bit of whole grain flour, with possibly adding some type of berry or some kind of fruit that can help increase the nutrient intake. These are all ways that we are forward thinking when it comes down to the mind diet. So baking, I would also say that um, as far as whole grain flour, is that what you mentioned? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and one of the ones that I was thinking of too that we do a lot is muffins, adding a scoop of whole grains to muffins or those oat muffin recipes that have been in the back of your recipe section. Those are a really good way to get some more whole grains in the morning. And like you're saying, maybe a little bit of dried fruit or a nut or something like that, but just really considering revisiting some of those simple recipes and making some of those simple changes, I think is something that a lot of us can pull. We said some in the chat, some people said banana breads and things like that. Some of you have recipes that you don't have to look at anymore. But maybe that banana bread recipe, we're just adding a little bit of an extra scoop of whole grains into these kind of ones that have been in the kitchen for a long time. And Tammy says in the chat, gosh, all the good foods are loaded with sugar. And, that is one of the things about cooking and pulling out those recipes on your own, like you said, Greg, that we can cut down the sugar.
Yeah.
We can still use the old recipes and follow them, but just cutting down on the sugar goes a long way as well.
Absolutely. And people are always concerned about, they always say, what about the fact that whole grains are still broken down into our bodies as glucose, which is sugar in a sense. And yes, it's true that all carbohydrates, whether that's from a pure sugar source, like a piece of candy, or from a whole grain, like a whole grain pasta or bread or whatnot, it is broken down as a final product as glucose, aka sugar in the bloodstream. However, focusing more on the whole grains and less on the added sugar will in turn, long term at least, be beneficial for your health because along with that whole grain, you're getting some of those other minerals that I just talked about. You're getting some more of that fiber that I just talked about. All of these are positively correlated with improved brain health compared to that sugar, the plain sugar, the sweet, that you're not getting all of those other nutrients and all of those other vitamins, minerals, and fiber within. So it's more beneficial to focus on that whole grain, finding out ways that you can incorporate it, consume it, use it more to support your overall health.
So, if you had one challenge for all the folks that are tuned in today for the week ahead, what is the brain healthy challenge of the week?
Brain healthy challenge of the week is to replace one of your non-whole grain foods with a whole grain. That's what I would encourage you to do this week. I would encourage you to replace a non-whole grain food. And by non-whole grain, I mean any carbohydrate that is not considered a whole grain. So I'm mainly talking about the sweets and the desserts and finding a way to incorporate something with the whole grain within that product. So one example I'm thinking about, if you are a baker, and you like to bake sweets, let's try to use a whole grain flour, right? Maybe not for the whole entire batch, but maybe half of the batch. Let's test it out with that whole grain product. And let's see if we notice a big difference, right? And even if we do, just know that that whole grain product would be a little bit more beneficial, higher in overall nutrients in comparison to that non-whole grain or that refined grain, etc.
All right, we've got some thumbs up and some agreements coming into the chat. Some people are going to try out some new grains this week. We've got a challenge, even though we know there's 3 servings or 3 cups a day. We're just thinking about maybe one a meal. And maybe that doesn't happen all in one day or all at once, but just thinking about adding in those servings of whole grains, maybe 3 times a day. And we've got some folks that says, yes, they're known for creating concoctions here at home, and we'll get to it this week with doing some of those substitutes. So thank you so much, Greg, for your encouragement and your expertise. It always makes the Mind Diet seem so approachable. And also keeping in mind that there are simple changes that we can make that are not overwhelming, are not going to cost us more, but may just be a small shift in the way that we think about how we're eating.
I like what you just said, a small shift in the way that we're thinking or eating. That's really what it is. And I just want to share this story, Megan. I had somebody from one of our classes on Monday who has found immense value in the nutrition talks that we have and et cetera. And just talked about just one simple change that he started making. He started to drink a lot more smoothies in the morning with oats inside of it, with a tablespoon of olive oil, because we tried this in one of our classes recently. And that was one of the smallest changes that he made. And I told him, I was like, this is pretty significant, actually. You may think it's small because to us, we're thinking in the case of changing everything all at once, all the time, every single day, when a small change that is a significant change can be adding a single ingredient into something that you normally consume. And for him, it was making that smoothie with some oats in it. And I was really proud. I was really happy. Of course, as a dietitian, I'm happy to hear that. But that small change doesn't have to be so significant, but it when it's meaningful, it'll show. And I think
So
for him,
celebrate the small changes this week. Give yourself credit for when those moments do happen. Because like you said, Greg, sometimes what's small, it can really be big and impactful. And we've got a lot of thank yous coming in from the chat for all of your advice and really just the way that you presented it as well. We're going to let everybody have access to this recording on YouTube in the next day or so. We're going to really get into maybe trying some couscous this week. Maybe we figure out some barley or some bulgur and add it to the diet. And as you do, celebrate your successes and know that you're doing it from a place that is really hopeful about the future of your brain health. And we just want to encourage you to move towards those milestones. And that's a big deal. So thank you, Greg. And we'll see you all next week. We're going to be back next week and talking about a little bit more deeper dive into get into the complexity of the aging hands with our occupational therapist, Maureen Burke. So we will see you all next week. Thanks, everybody.
I'll take care. See you soon.